Good morning from the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut. We're back this morning for another Facebook Live on the Indian Rock Nature Preserve. And this time we are down by our wigwams where we do Native American education programming for school groups. But all around the wigwams here are trees. And these trees in particular are white pines, eastern white pines. So we're going to do a little spot on the eastern white pine this morning, a very common native species found here in Connecticut, across eastern United States, up in Canada, and how you can use some features of this plant to identify them. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how wildlife values this tree and some historical uses from Native Americans. So thanks for joining us this morning, and let's get started. So the eastern white pine is fast growing and very long lived, and they're tall. So we're looking straight up here. And it's got these fine feathery needles, an open canopy. And they've got this really nice straight trunk. So if we start here at the bottom, and we pan up, we've got this really nice straight trunk going right up. And what they have is they have horizontal parallel branches, and one row is added each year of growth. So we'll take a closer look at that, starting kind of at the bottom of the tree. So right there we see where a branch was coming off, but it was dropped right here. And then if we go up right about a foot, we get the next level. We go up a little bit more than a foot, we have the next level. So this is essentially a year's worth of growth. Of course, the amount of growth a tree has per year can vary based on factors such as sunlight and water, if there's any disease or pests. But the branches that come out on this level are very horizontal parallel. So they'll go right around the tree. We see one branch was here, there's another branch here, and there was another coming out here. So the tree, the eastern white pine, will shed bottom layers as they grow. So they have a very open canopy. And this gives us a really great way to look at the bark on the tree. So like a lot of trees, the bark changes as this tree matures. So if we, let's see, find a young eastern white pine, like this one here, the bark is generally smooth. It's this kind of greenish gray color. And as the eastern white pine starts to mature, the bark is going to go from this grayish color more like a little red, and layers of almost, it looks like scales are going to start to form, kind of broken into a regular block. So if we look at a little bit older white pine, we can start to see that happening. Okay, so the bark is going from smooth to being kind of broken up. It looks like all these irregular patterns and scales. And this is going to continue as the tree matures. Those scales are going to deepen, they might start to curl a little bit. So we're looking at something like this. So bark can change as a tree matures. But we can still kind of see remnants of old branches here. If we go up a little bit, there's the next level. And if we tilt the camera up a little bit, there's our next level, and so on and so forth. So the bark does change as the tree matures, going from smooth to really furrowed and cracked into kind of these irregular scales. Now, another great way to identify an eastern white pine, especially because eastern white pines are evergreens, so they are green, they do keep their color all year round. Or if we look back up, they've got that nice green that's all year round. They have needles. We'll take a look at some needles. But evergreens, these needles are waxy. So if we look at the forest floor, we have dropped needles, those brown needles that have stayed on for 1 or 2 years and then have fallen off, just old age. And then green needles, which are fresher drops. This looks like it came from a whole branch, so the wind might have just blown that off. But they have needles, and they're green. They're waxy. Okay, the waxiness is going to help with water conservation, right, especially in the winter time. So this plant has a waxy coating on the needles, so water is conserved inside the needle. Now the eastern white pine, if you think about it, white, how many letters are in the word white? Right, there's W-H-I-T-E, 5 letters in the word white. So we're going to look at some needles of the eastern white pine. Okay, the needles are long, about 3 inches. They're really soft, really bendy. Okay, but these needles are in little clumps. Let's see here. They're in little bunches. And if we were to count them, there are going to be 5 needles in that little bunch. So the word white has 5 letters. We are looking at an eastern white pine that has 5 needles clumped together. So that's a great way to remember you are looking at an eastern white pine. 5 letters in the word white, 5 needles clumped together. Okay, they're coming off the stem in a little bunch. This is different than, say, a red pine that's going to have typically 2 needles coming off, or a pitch pine, which will typically have 3. So different trees will have different groupings of their needles. Now I did find a pine cone of the eastern white pine. So this is how this tree is reproducing. They can be up to 8 inches long. This one's more about 5, the size of my hand. This is from years past, so this is not a pine cone from this season. Okay, all the seeds are gone, all the scales of the pine cone are open, all the seeds are gone. They could have been eaten by animals. Loads of birds and squirrels will eat the seeds. Or they could have been dispersed by the wind. But the pine cone is how this tree is reproducing. So the pollen inside the pine cone will be spread around by the wind. So wind is a pollinator in this situation. Seeds will develop inside the pine cone. And then it'll hang onto the tree, then drop spread around, or be eaten by animals. Okay, so our eastern white pine cone is about 5 to 8 inches long. That's not like our red pine, which is going to be very short, almost 2 to 3 inches. Okay. So these eastern white pines do have a lot of uses. Today they're used for timber. But Native Americans would use the eastern pine for loads of reasons. Okay. There's resin that comes out. And the needles have a medicinal value. Okay, so does the resin. So the resin would be used kind of like an antiseptic. It'd be smeared on wounds and used kind of as a healing ointment. And it was also boiled up to make a tonic drink. The needles, rich in vitamin C, so they would be made into a tea. And with animals, especially on a nature preserve where we have loads of wildlife species, okay, these trees are awesome for food sources, but also for shelter. So all sorts of animals are using these trees. Okay, so for mammals, we're thinking black bears, beavers, rabbits, porcupines, squirrels. These animals are going to be eating the bark. And the seeds. Primarily eating the seeds will be the red squirrels and chipmunks. Typically at the bottom of a pine tree you might find a bunch of empty pine cones because those animals have eaten all the seeds. But then for birds, it's an awesome habitat and source of food for, let's say, the hairy woodpecker, chipping sparrow, the whippoorwill, hawks. Okay, so sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks, smaller hawks, are going to place their nests on larger branches closer to the trunk. Blue jays we see a lot in here, crows, grackles, even mourning doves. So overall, it's a nice, picturesque tree. To review, we've got a tree, the eastern white pine, that has a very straight trunk. It'll grow a new level of branches each year, parallel branches. It'll drop the lower ones. It's got a nice open canopy. The younger trees, remember the younger trees, the bark changes as they mature, so we're starting off with a smooth gray-green and moving our way to a furrowed, cracked, irregular pattern, scaly-looking bark. We have needles. Remember the word white, eastern white pine, 5 letters in the word white. We're going to have needles in bunches of 5. This tree reproduces using pine cone seeds, pollinated by the wind. The seeds are also winged, so the wind can blow the seeds away when they get out of the pine cone, unless they're eaten by animals. Modern day uses include timber, but it did have medicinal uses in the past with Native Americans. And it's an excellent source for wildlife with shelter and food. With its really dense branches, loads of seeds, there's great bark to eat. And this is a native species to Connecticut. So this is a tree species that you can find when you go for a hike, particularly if you're visiting the Barnes Nature Center. As always, our trails are open sunrise to sunset 7 days a week. We'll be back tomorrow on the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut Facebook page for another live program at 10 a.m. Of course, if you have an environmental topic that you're interested in that you would like us to cover, you can comment below on this video or message us, and we'll be sure to cover it for you. But thanks for tuning in this morning, and we hope that you'll join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m.